Hello, good evening. Welcome back, scholars. So today is Tuesday, so we'll be having a class for standard 11th, right? So first of all, good evening everyone, and I hope everyone's doing well and had a good day today, right? So as usual, we'll be dealing with chapter 2 today, right? Which is titled as Writing and City Life. So this is the third part of the chapter. And just to give you a heads up as to what will be, what will happen this week, is today's class we'll deal with some sub themes, and even on Thursday's class we will be dealing with the same chapter, and by Thursday, by the end of class, I'll make sure to finish the syllabus of the second chapter, right? So that gives us one day remaining in this week, which is Saturday. And on Saturday, we'll be having a quiz for chapter 2, right? So I hope everybody is familiar with what's going to happen in this week, right? As far as the 12th standard kids are concerned, right? So a couple of people are here. Hello, Ria. Hi, Sreshta. Okay, so Tanish, to answer your question of chapter 4 quiz for class 12, I know it was scheduled for yesterday, but because of some last minute emergencies, I had to reschedule it to Sunday 11 a.m. So the coming Sunday at 11 a.m. we'll be having the quiz for chapter 4. This is for 12 standard kids, guys, right? Yeah, so hello. Good evening, Ria. Hi, Tanisha. Good evening. Yeah, so today we are dealing with 11th class. I hope that's clear, Sreshta. Yeah, so we'll start off with the introductions, right? So my name is Nikitha, as most of y'all know me, and I am the history educator here at Unacademy Scholars channel, and I will be taking classes for standard 11th and 12th dealing with NCERT history, right? So a quick heads up, if you all want any information or updates regarding what is going to happen on this YouTube channel, which is called as Scholars, you all can join a Telegram channel for which the link is in the description below, and you will literally have updates regarding everything what's happening on the Scholars channel, right? So if you haven't joined already, you can go click on the description link below and join. And before actually diving deep, let's just look at some of the Unacademy plus and iconic features and the range of subscriptions available to you, right? So the first one is you can actually sit at your own houses and listen to some of the top educators of India, like their live classes, and all of these are available on one single platform, right? Like all of them are available on Unacademy Plus. You will have unlimited access to all these courses, and there are also regular doubt solving sessions, answer writing sessions. You can also take part in practice tests and live test series. Along with that, there is exhaustive coverage of syllabus. So like every educator here at Unacademy Plus, they make sure that they are covering the themes according to the syllabus mentioned given by the CBSE board, right? So that will be like a theme wise coverage of syllabus, so you don't have to worry about missing out on a particular topic, right? And there's also mentorship given to you along with guidance and also access to certain study materials in the form of PDFs, which you can later refer to for any queries or concerns you have regarding the subject, right? And as far as the subscriptions are concerned, like the pricing goes, the list is clearly available on the screen here, and there's a new addition to the range of subscriptions we already have, right? So instead of the 6-month subscription, we have two new ones, which is a 3-month and a 9-month subscription. But apart from these two, the other four are the same, which is 12-month, 15, 18 and 24, right? The prices are also clearly listed here, and you can opt in for any one you would like to, right? But just a small hack here, the fact that when you actually subscribe for a longer duration, the more beneficial it's going to be for you, because you can save yourself a couple of bucks by the end of the day by subscribing for a longer period, right? And we'll quickly move on to Unacademy Iconic. Here the features are even better, as in there's a personal mentorship program. Like personally, you can have conversations with your mentor slash guide, and you can literally ask him or her for any queries regarding the subject. And there are also live doubt solving sessions. There are weekly reports provided to you. There is a direct parent connect, and along with that, you will have access to study planners, which will make your job much easier in terms of timetable and studies, right? Yeah, so as far as the subscriptions goes for the Iconic, the durations are the same, which are 3, 9, 12, 15, 18 and 24 months. A pricing might change a little bit here and there, but the pricing is on the screen and you can have a look at it and subscribe to whichever one you want, right? Yeah. We will quickly start with the topic, right? Yes. Okay, cool. So any doubts in between, please interrupt me and ask me questions, right? I'll be very happy to answer them, right? So yeah, we'll start with a new sub-theme, which is urbanization in southern Mesopotamia, right? And we'll be exclusively talking about two aspects, which are construction of temples and how the kingdoms emerged, or how the kings actually lived, right? The main focus will be on the temples, but here and there we'll be looking at the imperial king states as well, right? So to start off, for any city to come up, for any city to develop, first there needs to be a certain population, right? Like a certain number of people residing together, like coming as a community and residing together in a particular geographical area, right? So when did people actually start doing that in Mesopotamia? That is the question. And for that, we have an answer, which is from 5000 BCE, right? From this particular time period, 5000 BCE, small settlements. Settlements are nothing but people living in communities, right? So people actually constructing their own homes or houses in a particular area and having like a permanent residence, right? So these are called settlements. These settlements started to come up in the southern region of Mesopotamia from like way back in 5000 BCE, right? So once the settlements happened, then different social factors, social forces acted upon these settlements, and eventually it led to the rise of cities, right? Those settlements itself transformed into one of the earliest cities in southern Mesopotamian region, right? So, but again, when it comes to the formation of cities, there are various kinds, right? Like how the city came into being or how the city came into existence has different explanations to it. The three major explanations can be these 3 points which I mentioned on the screen, right? So the first one of it is the cities actually developed around the temple areas, right? Or people actually started constructing like number of temples in a certain location, and that is how the urban life came into being, or cities gradually developed, right? So the main focus here is temples. That is one explanation. The other explanation which can be given is that these cities developed as centers of trade. What I mean by this is, let's say, like, you know, like from the very beginning, exchanges have been happening, right? Like international trade, sea trade, regional trade, right? Whatever it is, trade has been happening. For trade to happen, there needs to be a certain market, right? A certain place or a platform where people can actually exchange goods and services, right? So in order for that to happen, within the market areas, people started settling. People started building their house around these market areas. And that is how cities developed around these centers of trade, right? And the last one are basically imperial cities, but in this particular chapter we won't be dealing about imperial cities. We'll only be looking at the first two in great detail, right? So this is like a basic introduction for today's class. We'll be dealing about each of these aspects in detail from the next slide, right? Yeah. Okay. Any questions, guys? Please put them down in the chat box. After every slide, I'll be having a look at the chat box, right? So if any questions, I'll answer them. Yeah. So the early settlers, right? Like from the right from the beginning of the time, there are some people who, instead of roaming around here and there, like initially, as we have discussed in previous classes, the way people led their life is nomadic, right? Like people never had like a permanent house or a permanent settlement. They used to move from one place to another within the forest premises, hunting and gathering food, right? But there was a certain point where people realized that in order to carry out agriculture, because once you sow seeds, it needs a certain amount of time for crops to be grown and harvested, right? So for that to happen, people should not move from place to place, instead settle down in a particular place where the agricultural land is there, right? So these are the early settlers, like the first generation of settlers. Even though their origins are unknown, like how the settlement came into being or who were these people who settled, we don't know like the particular details of it. The origins are clearly unknown, but what they did, like what did early settlers do, was they began to build and rebuild temples at certain places within the villages, right? So they were living and they obviously believed in some supernatural element. Let's say it's some god or something, right? And obviously they needed temples in order to worship that god, to go and pray within the temple, right? So they started building these earliest temples. They just have a very simple structure. Like they were basically built with unbaked bricks, right? Within the bricks itself you have a variety of bricks, like sun dried bricks, clay stone bricks, like baked bricks and all that stuff. So the earliest temples were made up of unbaked bricks, right? And if that temple was destroyed or devastated because of some natural elements or something like that, they used to rebuild the temple in the same spot. That is an important point here, right? They used to rebuild the temple. And it's not just one god they had, but there were a number of gods, out of which two were really important to the people of Mesopotamian region, right? So first one is Ur, right? The god name is Ur, and he was basically the moon god, right? The second god is Inanna, like he was called as Inanna. This particular god had two associations. Sorry, this was a goddess, right? So this goddess, a female deity, was representing love on one side. On the other hand, the same goddess had association with war, right? So she was basically referred to as the goddess of love and war. So out of so many gods, these two were most important and mostly worshipped. They had a significant role to play in the religious lives of people, right? So these were basically like temples in general. They were considered residences of various gods, right? Just like how we stay in the houses, gods used to stay in the temples. That is the mindset people had back then, right? So initially they were very small. It was just like one room with a statue of god inside, right? But as time passed by, as centuries passed by, people actually started expanding the territory of the temple. Like huge temples came into existence. Like people actually started building huge temples, and this time it was not made up of unbaked bricks, but they were made up of proper concrete bricks, right? So large structures came into being, and it's not just the temple structure with like just the temple structure with the statue of the god, but surrounding the temple there were several rooms and also open courtyards, right? So what are these rooms used for? That is a question. They might have like multi-purpose uses, right? Some might use it for storing some sort of materials which are related to the temple, right? And in some others thought that these rooms were used for changing, because back in those days you can't enter the temple with anything you wear. Sometimes it's necessary for both men and women to dress up in a particular attire, and only then you're permitted to enter the temple, right? So in order for you to change, these rooms were there, right? So yeah, so basically the point here is the temple started growing in size as the centuries passed by. And some of the early ones, like the initial temples which were constructed, they were normally like ordinary houses, like how the outlook of the houses will be where humans stay. That is exactly how the temples also were constructed, because the simple fact that they were considered houses of gods and nothing like a supernatural construction, right? So that is why they looked like ordinary houses. But again, as time passed by, they had a certain structure to it. Like the temple always had a wall surrounding it. Like these are called as outer walls, right? And I'm just drawing the figure here for your convenience, guys. So let's just say this is the temple, right? This is the main premises of the temple. It always had a wall surrounding it. But as time passed by, to differentiate it from the normal household, right? To differentiate it with the outlook of the normal house, they started constructing these walls in a very zigzag manner, right? The wall, let's say this is the wall, right? Like the wall sometimes went like this, or sometimes like the irregular construction of the walls, right? So that irregularity, where the walls are going inwards and outwards and in every possible direction, that is what differentiated normal houses of people from temples, right? Yeah, I hope this point is clear, guys. Again, according to the architectural point of view, the way in which these temples were constructed is really important. That is why I'm focusing a little bit too much on this point, right? Cool. We'll move on to the next slide. Obviously, in a temple, the god was the focus of worship, which we all know, right? So we have something called as donations to God, right? Like even in the modern 21st century, if any of us are visiting a temple, we would like to offer something to the god, right? In the same manner, back in those Mesopotamian times as well, the god was offered variety of things like grains or curd or fish, right? So these three were three prominent items which were offered, and especially fish in particular, because we have seen how fish is like the staple food for Mesopotamian people, right? Because there are like rivers around the region, like Euphrates River, Tigris River, not just these two, but there are so many tributaries of these two rivers. Tributaries are nothing but channels, right? So you would find a lot of fish available, and fish was considered the staple food, and it was also offered to the god as a form of worship, right? How do we know that fish was mainly used, right? So when actually archaeologists were excavating all these temples in the early 20th century, they came across these temple floors which had thick layers of fish bones, right? Like so many layers of fish bones can be found within the temple premises, right? So that is how we got to know that fish was the main item which was offered to the god as a kind of worship, right? So what prominence or what significance did god have in those times? Like to be very honest, God was considered like one of the supreme being, and he, in a sense, that he was theoretically the owner of everything present in that particular region, right? Like he owned everything, including all the agricultural fields, the fisheries, the herds of the local communities, like all the animals, like all human beings. They were considered as properties of God, right? So that was how important God was, and in general the temple structure was, right? So the next point is basically how important the temple structure was. You will see that in order to process a particular produce, let's say you need to, like have oil. So you will have all these groundnut seeds or mustard seeds or olive seeds. You will crush them, like you will press those seeds in order to extract oil, right? So that particular procedure, in order to get a certain produce, right? So all the activities in the process of production, and some activities I've listed on the screen, like oil pressing, grain grinding, spinning, and weaving of woolen cloth, right? So these were done in the temple. So this should give you a rough idea as to how important or how sacred the temples were considered, were looked at, right? So all these production processes were happening within the temple, and not just that, organizer of production at a level above the household, employer of merchants and keeper of written records of distributions and allotments of grains, plough animals, bread, beer, and fish. So all these activities, not just production, but whatever was happening within the temple, right? Like some people were entering, some people were actually going out, or certain produce is coming into the temple, certain produce was distributed from the temple. So like all of these were written, they were written down by the scribes, right? So all of this, if you look at, it is conveying a particular point to us that the temple as a structure was very, very important, not just in terms of religious aspect, but it is one of the main contributions to the urban way of life, right? It was considered a main urban institution, guys. Like calling a temple as an urban institution, like a major urban institution, is a big thing. Because if you look at right now, like in the 21st century, if you go out, like if you look at a particular city, right, some mall or some restaurant or some hotel or some other different landmarks, they are considered as urban institutions, or let's say courts or parliament or whatever it is. But back in those times, the temple was considered a major urban institution because it was the place where so many activities were taking place, right? So yeah, so this was happening on the one side. This is not all which was happening. There was a different factor or like a different scene to the urban way of living, which we'll be looking at in the next slide, right? So but till here, any questions, guys? Is it clear? Again, these concepts are very important when it comes to your examination point of view. So that is why I'm focusing on every single point, right? Yes, exactly, Shiba. You got the point. Temple was considered some sort of administrative institution, right? So in the modern times, if we want to look at any administrative institutions, we look at some sort of government offices or some sort of headquarters and all that stuff. But back then, temple was considered as an administrative functionary, right? Yes, you're absolutely right, Shiva. Thanks for that. Yeah, so Tanisha says it's all clear. Cool. We'll move on then. Yeah. So these are some of the positive aspects to the city life. So now we'll be looking at some of the problems which the Mesopotamian people faced, right? Because in a city, there's positive and negative aspects, right? So now we'll be looking at the demerits of it. So in spite of natural fertility, like we talked about this in the first class, I remember, like even though there's no sufficient rainfall, but agricultural produce was very abundant in the Mesopotamian region, right? Yes, agreed. There was natural fertility, but agriculture was subjected to some sorts of hazards sometimes over the years. And we will look at what those hazards are, right? It can either be man-made or natural. Like it can be a natural hazard or a man-made hazard. The natural hazard being the floods. The fact that there were so many rivers, right? I was telling you how Euphrates River was there, Tigris River was there. There were so many tributaries of these rivers as well. So when there's excess, like heavy rainfall, or like sometimes there might be excess rainfall, right? Or these particular rivers might have changed their course. Like usually rivers will be flowing in this particular direction, but there are some times when so much silt is, let's say for example, so much silt is accumulated. Like silt is nothing but sediments, right? Like some sort of sand, mud and stuff. Let's say it is accumulated here, like there is a river flow and so much of silt is accumulated here. So when the river is flowing in this direction, it can't flow further because there's a barrier, there's a construction here. So it will change its course. Like it will start flowing in a different direction. And let's say there are fields here. Obviously all these fields will be submerged with the water, right? That is nothing but flooding of the river, flooding of the agricultural fields. So that's a loss, right? So that is what I mean by natural calamities, especially in the form of floods, right? So if you look at various archaeological records, we will actually come across that these Mesopotamian rivers have changed their routes so many times in history, right? Periodically, like at regular intervals, these have been changing. That means there's a loss to people who are practicing cultivation because of floods, right? This is the natural problem. The next thing is we'll move into some of the man-made problems, right? So, okay, so let's say, as I was telling you, there were a lot of mountain and hilly areas in the Mesopotamian region, right? Like especially in the northern Mesopotamian areas, it's not a plain area, right? There was a gradual steep. So some people used to live on the upper regions and some people used to live on the downstreams, right? So when the river is flowing from the upstream to the downstream, what upstream people used to do is they used to take so much of water, like excess abundant water, and that meant that people living downstream, they did not have sufficient water to irrigate their fields. Again, that is a man-made problem because the people living upstreams, they are stopping the flow of the water downwards, right? So this is one problem. And sometimes people, whoever are living upstreams, they are supposed to clean out the silt from time to time so that water will have a regular flow without any interruptions, because even the people living in the downstream areas need to have water, right? But sometimes it was not cleaned up. Like upstream people were not responsible enough to clean up the areas, and that blocked the water flow, and that basically meant that there was no sufficient water to the people living downstream, right? So there was this constant struggle, there was this constant conflict over land and water within the Mesopotamian countryside. Water because obviously the example we saw right now, and land because obviously the fact that they are facing problems if they are living downstreams. People wanted to go and construct their houses upstream. So that is a struggle for land, right? So this constant tussle for land and water was very much prevalent in the Mesopotamian countryside. Yeah. Okay, I do not see any questions. We'll move forward. Yeah, so now we will bring another aspect into the picture we are talking about, which is basically the authority slash rulers slash kings slash chiefs, whatever you want to call it. There are different names to it, right? So when this constant struggle was going on between land and water, let's say the upstream people had a different society and they had a different king. The downstream people had a different king. And when the war was going on, some people will emerge victorious, right? Like one group will be successful and the other group will be defeated. So whichever group was successful, they had this power, like they had this authority to loot the wealth of the defeated people. Not just the wealth, but even the humans themselves were taken as prisoners and they were employed as guards or servants. Like they were given all these dehumaning jobs, like menial jobs, right? They were made to work forcefully. So if you lose in a war, that was like a literal torture, right? So now what are we seeing here? That a particular group of people or like a particular king is exerting dominance slash authority slash power on a different set of people who lost the war, right? So this is the emergence of state, emergence of some sort of power, right? Yeah. So by doing that, by taking these humans as guards or servants, the king who has won the war or the chief who has won the war, he will have an increase in influence and clout. Again, clout is nothing but power, right? So he can exert his dominance over different people and different regions, right? A human tendency, like who doesn't want power in their hands? Who doesn't want to dominate, right? It's every human nature that they want to acquire power. So obviously, the king who won was very happy with it. Yeah. So these are basically referred to as war leaders because the only thing they were interested in is wars. The only thing they were interested in is acquiring power or dominance, right? So, but these kind of rulers, they easily used to fade away. Like they would be here today, but they would be gone tomorrow. Like that is how short term the existence of the war leaders were. But as time passed by, these war leaders were replaced with actual leadership, like people who not just were the rulers of a particular kingdom, not just interested in war, but they actually looked after the well-being of the community, right? In order to look after the well-being of the community, what did they do? They created new institutions or practices. Like they would guide the people in a certain way. They would tell that, like in order to lead your life, like follow these principles or follow these ethics. They used to expand the markets, like facilitation to expand the markets, facilitation to increase the trade, like all these like welfare activities, right? Like if you think of a 21st century modern state, what are some of the welfare activities that the state carries out? Like laying out roads, transportations, railways, and all that stuff. So these are termed as welfare activities. Back then, these developments and these technologies weren't there, but there were certain activities which were referred to as welfare activities, and they used to be carried out, they were carried out by the leaders who were replacing the war leaders, right? These are called the actual leaders who were interested in the well-being of the community, right? So again, in a war, if a particular side or a particular group wins, he has the authority to loot. Looting is nothing but robbing, right? It's like some sort of unofficial robbing. So they used to rob from people who were defeated. And what did they do with this wealth? They used this wealth to construct temples, not just constructing them in a basic sense, but they used to beautify them, like decorate them, like making all these sculptures, like wall decorations, like paintings and all that stuff, right? So because of the war, because some group is emerging victorious, there is a possibility for the beautification of temples, right? So what do you see here? A close connection between the development of temples and the development of kings or authority, right? That's a interrelated connection. Yeah. So yeah, that was for this slide. Yeah, so for the beautification of temple to happen, right, you need certain things. And as I was telling you in the earlier class, Mesopotamian region did not have natural resources, right? It did not have any metals, it did not have any precious stones. So, but there was a dire need of these stones and metals to construct temples and decorate them. So what did the kings do? The kings send out men to far off regions, like to different regions, especially these Gulf countries where all these precious stones were available, in order to acquire some certain fine stones and metals and bring them back to the land. Like we were talking about this one story last class, right? Like how a king called Enmerker, like he was responsible for initiating trade in the first place. So there was an authority bestowed in the king to send people across to different areas and acquire stones and precious metals, right? So again, the second point is pretty much self-explanatory. They organize the distribution of temple wealth in an efficient way by accounting for things that came in and went out. As I was telling you, like whatever was coming in and going out of the temple, it was pretty much recorded. Like these records are the main source for us, which are providing information about how Mesopotamian people lived their life, right? So every account, every transaction was noted down, right? So again, like a refreshing your memory, right? This was the point which we studied last class. We've seen a poem from Enmerker's episode, and what is the significance of the trade? This basically gave the king high status in the society, because if a temple is constructed or if a temple is decorated, people will talk about it, right? Like people whoever are living there, they'll be like, oh wow, like that almighty king by name Enmerker has constructed and beautified this temple. So people will talk about it. That is basically the fame which the king is going to get, and that means high status in the society. And kings loved it. Like kings liked this popularity and familiarity, right? And they also had the authority to command the community. Like they can look down upon people, like they are superior to people. They can order a certain person to go to a far off land and bring whatever he needs. So that is like commanding people, right? And people were obliged to obey the orders because they are being protected by the king, right? So they had to obey the orders of the king. Yes. Thank you, Shiva. Thank you for that point. But like, this is just like some sort of analysis I'm doing for you to understand that every aspect of society, be it political life, be it economic life, be it cultural life, whatever it is, as uh, okay, let's just call ourselves as humanity students or like social science students instead of particularly referring to history, right? Because every aspect of it is interlinked, right? So we are studying history, we are looking at history as a subject here, but we are looking at political life, we are looking at economic life, we are looking at cultural life. The point I'm trying to make here is everything is connected, right? Yeah, thank you for that, Shiva. Manya, in order to answer your questions as to two history teachers, right? Yes, there are two history teachers, and it's not like some sort of problem or something. There are like n number of teachers teaching the same discipline for the same class, on Unacademy platform, on different Unacademy channels, right? That is how the Unacademy operates. So yeah, that's like the internal functioning of it. But yes, you can attend both the classes, that is not a problem, right? The other teacher might be dealing with a different topic, I might be dealing with a different topic, but whichever one you are interested in, whichever one you want to follow, you can opt in for it, right? Okay, a couple of new people joined. Hello everyone and good evening to whoever joined right now. Yeah, okay, then we'll move on, right? Did we finish? Yeah, we finished the slide. Yeah, so now the point we are going to look at here is the interdependence of common people and the kings or chiefs or leaders, right? So what is the interdependent point here? People, like wherever kings are there, like let's say kings are located in a particular region X, they are living there, like their palace, court, families, whatever, they are living here. They asked the villagers to come and settle around that palace. Why is that so? Because if they are literally like scattered away, let's say villagers are all here or somewhere like scattered away, it's difficult for them, like during the times of war, obviously kings needed an army. And to be very clear on this point, kings did not have a standing army, right? Standing army is like a permanent army. Kings did not have that. They only relied on the normal people, like not even soldiers. They relied on people during the time of war, and after the war was ended, people used to go back to their own personal occupations. Like that is how an army was there. So let's say now the war is starting. In order for people to travel from a different region to the capital region, it would be very difficult. The transportation might be a huge problem. So that is why king asked the villagers or like the common people to settle around the fort or the palace, because during the times of war it's going to be very easy and helpful, right? And that also is like an incentive for common people to settle around the palaces. Why? Because if they live around the palace, king will protect them, right? So this is like a mutual interdependence. King is giving protection to the people, and in return people are acting as soldiers during times of war. This is like an interdependent relationship, right? Like mutually reinforcing certain occupations, certain tasks. This in turn is leading to development, right? So development in every sector possible. That is how the city life was slowly, like gradually it was developing, right? Yeah, so yeah, the second point is also pretty much covered. And here, if you look at this point, at Uruk, which is one of the most popular cities in the Mesopotamian region, one of the earliest temple towns, like it was one of the early places where temple was constructed, we usually find depictions of armed heroes and their victims. So this is telling us that war was a very frequent thing, it used to happen, and people used to die in the war, and there were certain victims of war, right? So it's telling us a certain war strategy or like a military life, right? So if you look at the archaeological surveys done by various archaeologists in the early 20th and late 19th century, you will realize that by 3000 BCE, by this particular time period, the Uruk as a town slash city, it grew so much in size, right? It almost had like 250 hectares under its control. 250 hectares is a lot, guys, right? Back in those times, 250 hectares is a lot. And by 3000 BCE, Uruk consisted of 250 hectares. And just to give you a rough idea of what 250 hectares looked like, uh, if you look at Mohenjo-daro, like we've seen how Mohenjo-daro is a part of Harappan civilization, It's in the Indian subcontinent, right? So y'all know how big the Mohenjo-daro is in general. So this Uruk was double the size of Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-daro. That is how huge the Uruk settlement was by the time by the 3000 BCE time mark, right? Yeah. So as I was telling you that people were actually coming together and settling in places around the fort or around the palace, right? That means the city way of life is coming up in a particular region, but all those villages were being deserted. Like nobody was staying there because everybody was coming and staying within the city limits, right? So that means villages were deserted. And this led to a major population shift. Like people have been traveling here and there, like migration was happening, population shift was happening, and all that stuff. And if you look at this particular figure, this is not the original figure, guys. This is just one of those 3D figures drawn by the historians or modern day scholars to understand what the Mesopotamian cities looked like, especially the Uruk city, right? Again, this is not a original landscape. Don't look at it as something original, right? It's a 3D view. So this is the city of Uruk, right? So if you look around, like these are all the settlements, trees, houses, some sort of big buildings, some sort of agricultural fields and all that stuff. And as I was telling you, this is like the place where king lived, right? So these are all the settlements around the palace. And around all these houses, there was a wall. Like this whole thing I'm drawing, right? It's a wall. You can see pretty clearly that there's a fortified wall. What does this mean? That the king is offering protection to the people by constructing a defense wall around the settlements, and no outsider can penetrate into the Uruk city that easily. It's very difficult. Like you're supposed to get permissions, there needs to be some sort of entry slips and all that stuff. It was a difficult task basically for an outsider to come and settle within Uruk, right? So this is basically telling us that the king is providing protection to the people by building defensive walls, right? And if you look at the size of the settlement again, from 4200 BCE till 400 CE. That is a lot, guys, almost like 5 millenniums, right? So throughout this 5 millenniums, the settlement of Uruk was never deserted. Like it was never deserted. Some people or the other, like different generations, different kinds of peoples, different races of peoples, they did reside in the settlement of Uruk for these many years. And in fact, it was just growing large and large in size as the time passed by. And if you look at the rough estimate of 2800 BCE, it expanded to almost 400 hectares, right? In the previous slide, we saw how Uruk was 250 hectares by 3000 BCE, and within 2 centuries itself, it almost grew to 400 hectares, right? So that is how important the city of Uruk was back in those times. Okay. Siddhant, can you please elaborate on your point? Because like how do you want it to be? Like you want it to be in like the shorter points or like using bullets and all that stuff? How do you want it to be, Siddhant? Just type down your suggestions. I'll be very happy to incorporate them from the next presentation. You type it down. In the meanwhile, I'll move on to the next slide, right? Because we're running out of time. Yeah. So war captives and local people, as I was telling you, if a particular side loses, they were took by the king who won as war captives, right? So these war captives, they were made to work within the temple, and also under the king. Again, dehumaning or like not respecting the other humans who lost the war, right? So if you look at the taxing, agricultural taxes and all that stuff were there, right? People used to pay taxes to the king, and king in return used to carry out all these welfare activities, but it was not a mandatory thing. It was not like a compulsory thing which you need to do, right? It was an optional thing. And instead, people whoever used to work in the temples and under the king, they were paid rations. Again, what are rations? Rations are okay, like in the modern days, if you work, you'll be given a salary, right? Salary in terms of monetary cash. But back then, instead of salaries or cash or coins or currency and all that stuff, because there was no currency or money to be exchanged, they were paid rations. Rations in terms of food, rations in terms of utilities like household survival needs and all that stuff. Let's say they're given 2 kgs of rice or like tomatoes or vegetables or whatever it is, they were paid in terms of ration, right? And how do we know that? Because when archaeologists actually started excavating all these areas, there were hundreds of ration lists found, right? And on those lists, you can clearly see that a person's name was written, and beside the name, what all did he get as a ration was also listed. Like materials like grains, materials like cloth or oil, like these were allotted to the people as rations, and the quantities which were given were according to the work they did, right? And to give you a rough estimate of how many days and how many people were involved in the construction of a temple, again this is an anonymous, like we don't know which temple it is, but some random temple, right? It was estimated that it took 1500 men, like 1500 men had to put in effort for every day for almost 5 years, and not just 2-3 hours of work a day, but 10 hours of work a day. Imagine 1500 men working for 10 hours a day for 5 years straight. If this happens, then one temple was constructed. So by this, what are we referring? That temples eventually were very huge in size. They were very magnificent. Like, like they had all these grandeur attached to them. That is the point we basically need to infer from this statement, right? Any questions till here? Sahil, don't worry, just listen to the chapter from here, but once the live ends, you can still access it on YouTube. That's okay, you can watch it later, right? It will be recorded. Yeah. If no questions, we will move on. Yes, so where was I? Yeah. We've seen how rulers were commanding people, right? Like to go to far off regions and get me that stone, get me this metal in order to construct temples, right? So because of this, what is happening? Again, you making use of materials from a distant land means that there's a certain kind of development happening. And because of all these precious stones like lapis lazuli and all that stuff, technical advances were also happening at Uruk. And when was this happening? It almost was around 3000 BCE, right? So the point to remember here is technical advances, right? And in order for something to be constructed or made, tools were very crucial, right? So these tools, they were made of stone initially, but we have discussed how this period was a Bronze Age, right? So eventually bronze was heavily used to manufacture all these tools, which were later used for various crafts, right? And Yeah, so again, this point is important, guys, this architect's point. So what I mean by this is, if you're constructing like a large hall or like a large temple, usually they were made of wood, right? Wood or like dried bricks or like sun dried bricks and all that stuff. These are not so strong. These are weak structures, weak materials. So, but when you're constructing like a large hall, in order to make sure that it stays for a longer period of time, architects found out a new way, that instead of dried bricks or wood, we can switch to brick columns, right? That was like, again, a particular design or a method in which the bricks were manufactured, and also the design in which they were placed to construct a particular structure, right? So that is the work of architects who came up with a new designing that made sure that the buildings lasted for a longer period of time instead of being destroyed, right? So again, the same points, like hundreds of people were putting in effort to carve great structures, to paint the temples by creating a colorful mosaic. Like, the main intention was to decorate it. Like, if it is looking very elegant, like if it's aesthetically pleasing, that is how much the king is going to be appreciated by the people, right? So king literally gave his all to decorate the temple because he wanted that fame among people. He wanted that power, right? The only way he could legitimize his power, to exert his power, is through construction of temples, right? Yeah, and especially when it comes to sculpture, it is not that easy to make all these sculptures using clay. So that is why from the clay they shifted to stone, because stone is a hard material, right? So even if you carve something on it, if you engrave something on a stone, it will be forever there instead of breaking or like being destroyed or whatever. So that is why there was a shift from clay to stone, right? Yeah. So another technological landmark, like I was telling you, right? Like there was technological advances happening in Uruk around 3000 BCE. This is the point we saw in the last slide. And one of the significant technological landmark was the invention of the potter's wheel, right? So initially, before the potter's wheel was invented, people used to make use of hands in order to make pottery, but that was really a very difficult task. Like, it was really difficult. It used to take a lot of days for a potter to make one pot. Like, it was very time consuming, it was very exhaustive as well. But once the potter's wheel was invented, right, like you might have seen images of potter's wheel in different movies or documentaries, right? Like, this is basically the potter's wheel. There's a wheel which is rotating niche, and on that people use the potter used to take the clay and mold it with the help of his hands, right? That was a very easy task. It also made sure that so many pots were manufactured in the single day, because it only took a lot less time to manufacture a single pot, right? So it's not that time consuming. So that is one technological landmark, right? Okay, any doubts still here? Okay, so Sahil has a doubt. What is your doubt, Sahil? Please put it down in the chat box, type it down. So in the meanwhile, Siddhant, if you're still there, can you please elaborate on your question? If not, we'll take Sahil's question, right? In this quiz too, there was no subject of humanities. Sahil, I am not quite sure if I have understood your question, but the basic underlying point is, if you're trying to attempt quizzes from chapter 2, if that is exactly what you're trying to convey to me, because I clearly didn't understand your point, but if you're wanting to give quizzes, the one way I can help you with is you can wait till Saturday, because on Saturday we'll be having a mentee quiz on this chapter, on chapter 2, right? So that is one way in which I can help you, I guess, regarding that. What is 3 crore, Sahil? 3 crore for what? Okay, just type it down. In the meanwhile, I'll go forward because we're already running out of time. Right, after the next slide, I'll explain your further questions, right? Yeah, so the last sub-theme we'll be talking for today is life in the city, right? Like how people lived in the cities, what was the standard of living, or what were some of the certain practices or traditions which they followed, right? Like the city people followed. So we've seen that there was a clear distinction between ruling elite, which is the kings, the palaces, the kings' families, and the smaller section of the population which are not that rich, or which did not have the majority of the wealth. The major portion of the wealth was with the ruling elite, right? So this clear distinction was very much established. And how do we know that, right? The one way to look at it is burials. And if you look at the royal burials, where the kings and queens at the city called Ur, where they were buried, if you look at these burials, it is pretty clear to us that along with the dead body, certain other things, like material things like jewelry or gold vessels or wooden musical instruments and all these stuff, all these precious materials, right? All of them were buried along with the dead body. And once archaeologists started excavating these burials, they realized that the majority of the wealth was in the hands of the kings, and there was a clear distinction in terms of financial element, right? So that is what we know about the kings. But what about ordinary people, right? How did they live their lives? Yeah, so so if you look at all these textual sources we have from the Mesopotamian region, right? Be it, as I was telling you, everything was recorded. The scribe, or the person who is in charge of accounting, writing all of these down, he made sure that literally everything was put down on the paper, and these are basically referred to as legal texts, right? So through these legal texts, we get the information that in the Mesopotamian society, the kinds of families that were prevalent, or the norm which was followed, was a nuclear family. What does a nuclear family mean? A husband, a wife, like a married couple, and their kids, right? It was a small family. So the basic norm followed was nuclear family, which is very similar to what we experience in the 21st century today, right? Like mostly we see nuclear families even today. So, but sometimes there is an exception, that if the particular son is married, the son and his family, like his wife and his children, also used to live with the uh, original family, right? So it was a family never exceeded, like never included relatives, nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles. No, that was not the case. It was always a nuclear family, sometimes with the married son's family also living with them, right? Yeah. Oh, okay, Sahil, I get your question right now. So this is basically a quiz conducted on 18th and 19th of this month, September, right? So if you go and read the description below, like this video's description, you will clearly find the details to what the contest is, right? First you need to register for that quiz and give that quiz, right? So after you give the quiz, if you you like people from all over India are going to give the quiz, right? So if you emerge in like the top 10, top 15, or like whatever satisfactory ranks according to the cutoff, then you will be rewarded with a scholarship, right? So this is the basic information I can give you, but how to register, the links used for it and all that stuff, please go and check the description below, right? You will clearly have details there. Right, Sahil? I hope that's clear. Okay, there are no humanity subjects. Okay, so again, every week these quizzes changes, right? Like for some weeks, science students can take part. For the other weeks, humanity students can take part, right? So I think this week, which is on 18th and 19th, it's for science kids. So yeah, hard luck, Sahil. The next time when this offer is there, I will definitely let you all know, right? But for this week, it's only for science kids. Yeah. Did you get a clarity, Sahil, or you have any other questions regarding that? Yeah, exactly, Sahil. That's what I'm saying. When there's a next announcement, I'll make sure that I will inform you all in one of my classes, right? The announcement is not out yet, but once when it's out, I'll tell you all, right? Cool. So we'll move forward, right? So we were talking about the families, right? So as usual, the system prevailing there was a patriarchal system where the father was the head of the family, and we know a little bit about how the marriages used to happen back then, right? So it was all based on consent, and if a match was there like between a bride and a bridegroom, the bride and her family was consulted first, and only if the bride's parents give consent to the marriage, only then the marriage used to take place, right? And from both the sides, from the groom side and the bride side, there was exchange of gifts, right? And they used to, when the marriage was happening, they used to eat together. Like having meals together is considered like a family thing, right? Like usually who eats meals together? Like don't take the parties or functions we attend outside, but like generally if you are having a meal together on a particular dining table under one roof, it means that they are your family members, because that's what family does, sharing food, right? So when the bride's family and the groom's family used to sit under one roof, right, where the marriage was happening, and the fact that they ate together meant that they are accepting each other to be a part of the family, right? So that is the significance of eating together. And they also made offerings in the temple while the marriage was happening, right? And after the marriage, it was a tradition that the mother-in-law of the bride used to go to her place, used to go to her house and ask her to come to her to the groom's house, right? So what do you say? Not kanyadan, but there is some word we have even in the 21st century, right? You know, like the basically the bride leaving her house to go to her husband's house. I'm not sure about what the term is called, but you get the reference, right? So when that was happening, the father of the bride used to give a certain amount of luxuries, you know, like be it anything, be it some form of inheritance, right? So he used to give that share to the daughter while she was leaving the house to go to her husband's place, right? But she never got house or herds or fields in terms of inheritance, because all these things were inherited by the male members of the family, by the sons basically, right? Again, there was a disparity between women and men, sons and daughters, right? Yeah. So that was about the marriage. We will have a quick look at Ur, right? Ur is another major city in Mesopotamia, and it was one of the earliest cities to have been excavated, right? So they know for a fact that Ur was one of the highly populated cities, and that is why archaeologists made sure that they are systematically excavating Ur. And this particular excavation happened right in the early 1930s, right? And if you see, narrow, okay, sorry, this is, I'm sorry for the spelling, guys, it's narrow, right, like thin. So if you look at the construction of the cities, you will clearly realize that the streets are very, very narrow. They're very, very thin, right? They were so thin that even the carts, like bullock carts or some sort of wheeled carts, they could not enter those streets. That is how thin they are, right? So, but let's say these are the streets, right? They are thin. House number 1, house number 2, house number 3, whatever. So when people are trying to carry like firewood or certain other grains into their houses, they need to carry, right? But they can't carry it with their hands. And also bullock carts were not helpful because the streets were narrow. So how did they go about this process? They made use of donkeys, right? Donkeys were thinner. They could fit into these streets, right? So they used to put all these grains and firewood on the backs of the donkeys, and they used to take it to their houses, right? Got this point? Yeah. So if you look at all these narrow streets, and also houses were very, very irregular, right? You have seen the picture a couple of slides earlier, right? Some were square in shape, some were rectangle in shape, some had random shapes to them, right? So the fact that there was no regular shape to the houses, and also the fact that all these streets were very narrower, it indicated that there was an absence of town planning. Again, if you remember from your earlier classes, I think in like class 8, 9, we talked about Mohenjo-daro, right? How Mohenjo-daro was one of the perfectly planned towns. There was a strict town planning in place. Like every house was constructed on a like straight line. Grid pattern was followed. 90 degrees perpendicular angles at every street and house and all that stuff. So this type of town planning is not present at Ur, and that is clearly evident because of the irregular shapes of the houses and narrow streets, right? Yeah. So again, this is basic. I'll just quickly wind up this slide because we're running out of time, guys. So the point here is of the drainage system. They did not even have like a proper drainage system, right? So, but in order to make sure that the roads were not filled with water and all that stuff, what did they do was they basically had these clay pipes, right, running into their inner courtyards. So let's say there was, let's say, a terrace, a house terrace. So if there is a rain or something, all that water used to come down through the pipe into the inner courtyards of the houses, right? So that is how the drainage system, or like the water outlet system, was present, instead of a water outlet system which led to the roads, right? So yeah, and also what used to happen is, if you look at this point, right, this made street levels rise, right? So whatever mud or whatever waste materials were there in the house, all of them were thrown into the streets. What does that mean? The level of the streets used to, like, again, it did not happen overnight. It took a lot of years for the street levels to be raised, because all the waste from the houses was dumped onto the streets, right? So when this happened, they need to make sure that the elevation of the house was also lifted. Otherwise, whatever mud was there in the roads, like on the roads, if there's a rain or downpour, it used to travel back into the houses, right? Like you're understanding, right? Like let's say this is the house, and on the upper field of it there are roads. Like roads are elevated, houses are downstairs, and if there's any rain, all the mud here, it used to travel back into the houses. People had to like constantly clean, right? So in order to avoid this thing, they made sure that the houses were elevated in the platform, right? And also, like, that is number one. Number two is they can't just, it's very difficult for them to get on to the roads if they are not on the same plane, right? So in order for these two reasons, they elevated the house's platform, right? Yeah, any questions till here, guys? Yes, Sahil, your point noted. I will definitely inform you. Yes. So I think this is the last slide we have for today, guys. I'll quickly wind it up in 2-3 minutes, right? So yeah, again, regarding the windows, right? Like usually in the modern houses we have today, we have like certain number of windows, be it for ventilation, be it for light, whatever it is. But back then there were no windows, especially in cities of Uruk and Ur, or like any place in Mesopotamia, let's say, there were no windows, but the light came in through the doorways, which were opening into the courtyards, right? So this was a source for the light to come in, and no windows basically meant that there was a lot of privacy to the families staying in, right? Again, as I was telling you, sometimes son's family also used to stay with the father's family, right? So son's family used to have some kind of privacy so that the mother-in-law or the father-in-law were not able to see whatever was happening inside the house, right? So that was some sort of privacy. And just like the modern times, living in India, we come across a lot of superstitions, right? So these superstitions were also there in the Mesopotamian regions, and especially in regards to the houses, there are a lot of superstitions, and we came to know about these because they were recorded in the tablets, like on the tablets, right? So for example, if you look at this thing, right, like a front door that did not open towards another house was lucky. So like both the houses should not face each other. If that is the case, then the house was considered to be lucky, or the house owner, he was expected to have a lot of wealth and like prosperity and all that stuff. Again, this is superstition. Whether that happened for real or not, we don't really know, right? And if like the main entrance of the house, like the main wooden door, if it opened outwards instead of inwards, right? If there's a door, it might open outwards, sometimes it might open inwards. But in this case, if it opens outwards, then it is considered that the wife would be a torment to her husband. Again, torment is nothing but like pain or like suffering, right? So basically the wife would dominate the husband or something like that, right? So these are some of the superstitions which were prevalent in the Mesopotamian society, right? And the last thing is there was a town cemetery for the people to be buried after their death. And this town cemetery, during the archaeological excavations, we came across one town cemetery at Ur, right? Ur, which is one of the famous cities again. And we don't see a distinction in the royalty and the common people burials, because within the same burials we came across royal people being buried and also the normal individuals. So we don't see that kind of social distinction. But one point to be noted here is we also came across some burials under the floors of the ordinary houses, like within the houses itself, within the house courtyard or whatever. They used to dig the land, bury it, and then put back the soil onto it, right? So again, what is the significance of it? Why did they do that? We really don't know, right? People might come up with certain speculations, right? It might be because I don't know, there was some sort of social difference, and the village head did not allow such people to be buried in the common cemetery or like the town cemetery. That might be one explanation. The other thing can be that they wanted themselves to be buried within the house premises or something. It can be anything, guys. Like, you can come up with n number of speculations when you don't have a perfect reason or an explanation to a social historical fact, right? Yeah. So that was for today. Any questions, guys? Please put them down in the chat box. Okay. Okay, Sahil, noted your point. Yes, don't worry. I will correct you if something is wrong. That is not a problem at all. Okay. What is your question, Sahil? You put up, ma'am, one question. What is that? Just type down your question. In the meanwhile, I'll wind up the session, right? Because we're already past time. Yeah. So regarding the pitch I made earlier in the beginning of the class, if anybody wants to subscribe either for Unacademy Plus or Iconic, y'all can use my code TUM10 and get a 10% off straight away while subscribing, right? And if you like the content of those videos and want more of them, please do like the video, share as much as you can, and exclusively please subscribe to Unacademy channel and scholars in particular, right? Also comment down below with any questions, any suggestions, with anything you have, and I will get back to you by the end of the day, right? Yeah. Sahil, permission for what exactly? Okay, Sahil, like you don't even have to call me ma'am, just call me the Sahil. Okay? Is that okay? Just call me Didi or whatever. Cool? Yeah. Chalo, then anyways, I'll see you guys on today is what? Tuesday, right? Yeah. I'll see you guys again on Thursday at 6 p.m. where we'll be finishing this chapter, like the second chapter. And as soon as we do that, in the Saturday's class, we'll be having a quiz on the whole of chapter 2, right? Again, I'm telling you before in hand because if you want to prepare for it, please do, right? It's going to be a Menti quiz and it's going to happen within the class hours itself, Saturday 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., right? So I'm hoping to see you guys again on Thursday 6 p.m., right? Till then, have a good evening, have a good day tomorrow as well, and yes, bye bye. Thank you so much for tuning in every day.